The African sunrise painted the savannah in shades of amber and gold. Mark Thompson adjusted his camera lens, searching for the perfect shot of the morning wildlife. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Not a predator's roar, not a bird's call. This was different. This was desperation in its purest form. He lowered his camera and scanned the horizon. Movement caught his eye. Something pale. Something moving fast. And it was headed straight toward him. As the shape drew closer, Mark's jaw dropped. A leopard cub. But not just any cub. This one was completely white, its coat gleaming like fresh snow against the dry grass. Every instinct told him this was impossible. Cubs don't approach humans. They hide, they flee, they disappear into the underbrush at the first hint of danger. Yet this tiny creature barreled toward him without hesitation, stumbling over the uneven ground in its haste. When it reached him, it collapsed at his feet, looking up with eyes that held a terror beyond its years. The cub cried out again, and Mark understood. This wasn't just fear, this was a plea. He knelt down slowly, and the cub immediately pressed against him, seeking shelter in his presence. Mark's mind raced through the implications. Leopard cubs don't abandon their mothers. If this baby was here, alone and terrified, searching for help from a human of all things, then something catastrophic had happened. The mother had to be nearby, and she had to be in serious danger. Mark examined the ground around them. There, faint impressions in the dust. Adult leopard tracks, heading east. He made his decision in seconds. Gently lifting the trembling cub, he felt its small body press against his chest. Instead of struggling, it seemed to relax slightly, as if finally finding a moment of safety. "All right, little one," Mark whispered. "Let's find your mom." The tracks led them across terrain that grew increasingly treacherous. Within the first hour, they reached a river. The water moved faster than it appeared, its brown surface concealing depths Mark couldn't judge. He knew the risks. Crocodiles hunted these waters. But the tracks continued on the far side, and turning back wasn't an option. He secured the cub against his shoulder and stepped into the current. The water was shockingly cold. It climbed past his knees, then his waist, pulling at him with surprising strength. The cub's claws dug into his shirt, its small body rigid with fear. Midway across, Mark spotted movement in the water ahead. A shadow, long and dark, gliding beneath the surface with predatory purpose. His heart hammered as he recognized the shape. Crocodile. A big one. He couldn't turn back now. He pushed forward, fighting the current, his legs burning with effort. The shadow paced them, patient and calculating. Mark could feel its presence like a weight in the water. 20 feet from shore, then 15, then 10. The shadow accelerated. Mark lunged for the bank with everything he had left, scrambling up the muddy slope. Behind him, massive jaws erupted from the water, snapping shut on empty air where his feet had been moments before. He didn't stop moving until they were well clear of the water's edge. The cub mewled softly against his neck. They'd made it. Barely. The journey continued into the midday heat. The tracks remained clear, but the cub was struggling now. It hadn't eaten since the ordeal began, and its small body was fading. Mark tried offering it water, but it needed food. Real food. That's when the ground beneath them began to shake. The rumble started as a distant vibration, then grew into a roar that filled the air. Mark turned to see an impossible sight bearing down on them. A dozen rhinoceros, each one weighing thousands of pounds, charging directly at their position in a full stampede. There was nowhere to run. The herd covered the entire width of the valley. Mark dropped to the ground, curling his body around the cub, preparing for impact. The thunder of hooves became deafening. This was it. Then, impossibly, the herd split. A young rhino had stumbled in the front, causing the lead female to veer sharply left. The rest of the group divided around the obstacle, creating a corridor. They streamed past on both sides, so close that Mark felt the wind of their passage and the ground vibrating beneath him. Dust choked the air, and then, as quickly as it had begun, they were gone. Mark lay still for several seconds, hardly believing they'd survived. When he finally sat up, the cub looked up at him with what he could swear was relief in its eyes. They pressed on, following the tracks to a buffalo carcass in a small clearing. The smell hit them first, death and decay baking in the afternoon sun. Vultures covered every inch of the remains, their bald heads slick as they fought over scraps. The cub needed to eat, but there was no way it could compete with these scavengers. Mark pulled an emergency flare from his pack. He lit it with a sharp crack, and brilliant red light flooded the clearing. Waving the hissing flare, he charged at the birds, shouting. The vultures scattered into the sky with angry cries, circling overhead but keeping their distance. He urged the cub forward. It ate quickly, tearing at the meat with desperate hunger. Mark kept the flare burning, keeping watch, giving the small animal precious minutes to regain some strength. With renewed energy, they continued tracking. An hour later, the trail ended abruptly at a deep pit hidden in the tall grass. A poacher's trap. Mark's stomach dropped as he peered over the edge. There she was. The mother leopard lay at the bottom, her white coat covered in dirt, her sides heaving with shallow breaths. She was magnificent even in her suffering, another rare albino, her beauty marred only by exhaustion and dehydration. Her eyes, though dimmed by pain, flickered up to meet his. As Mark knelt at the pit's edge, movement flashed near his hand. A scorpion, black and deadly, its tail arched to strike. His machete was out in an instant, cutting the creature in half before it could deliver its venom. Danger lurked everywhere in this wilderness. He worked quickly, fashioning a harness from rope and lowering it into the pit. The mother was weak, but some instinct made her cooperate. She pushed her head and shoulders through the loops with what little strength remained. Mark pulled. The weight was enormous. His muscles screamed in protest. Inch by inch, hand over hand, he hauled her up the earthen wall. When she finally lay on solid ground, he poured water from his canteen onto her tongue. She drank desperately. The cub rushed to her side, and their reunion was heartbreaking in its tenderness. Soft sounds, gentle touches, a mother and child reunited against impossible odds. But their relief was short-lived. The distinctive sound of hyena laughter echoed across the savannah. 6 of them emerged from the grass, their powerful bodies and hungry eyes focused on the weakened leopards. Easy prey. The mother tried to stand but couldn't. She managed only a weak snarl. Mark positioned himself between the predators and the leopards, machete ready, knowing it wasn't nearly enough. Then the tiny cub did something extraordinary. This small creature, barely larger than a house cat, launched itself at the lead hyena and clamped its jaws onto the animal's nose. It was suicidal bravery. The hyena thrashed violently, trying to shake off its tiny attacker, but the cub held on with the ferocity of a creature 10 times its size. The sight of her cub in mortal danger triggered something primal in the mother. Despite her exhaustion, despite the dehydration and injuries, she surged to her feet. The roar that erupted from her throat was pure maternal fury, a sound that promised death to anything threatening her baby. Mark seized the moment. He grabbed a fallen branch, thrust it into the embers of a nearby lightning-struck tree, and charged at the hyenas with the flaming torch, screaming at the top of his lungs. Fire and fury on 2 fronts. The hyenas broke and ran. Silence fell over the savannah once more. The mother collapsed, pulling her brave cub close. Mark knew they couldn't survive out here, not in their condition. They needed help. Real help? The next 2 months at the Wildlife Rescue Center passed in a blur of careful treatment and patient recovery. Both leopards suffered from the challenges of albinism, extreme sun sensitivity, compromised vision, genetic vulnerabilities. Mark visited daily, watching the cub regain its playful nature and the mother rebuild her strength. A bond formed between man and leopards that transcended species. Finally, the day came to release them into a protected reserve. Mark opened the transport crate. The mother stepped into the sunlight, her cub following close behind. They began walking into the savannah, heading home. Mark watched them go, his chest tight with emotion. But then the mother stopped. She turned and walked back to him. Looking directly into his eyes, she leaned forward and gently touched her nose to his outstretched hand. A gesture of gratitude, a connection that needed no words. The cub looked back once before bounding after its mother. Together, they disappeared into the vast wilderness where they belonged. Mark Thompson didn't just save 2 lives that day. He proved that courage and compassion can forge bonds that cross every boundary, that trust speaks a universal language, that sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen when we simply choose to help. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. What's the most incredible wildlife moment you've ever witnessed? Subscribe for more remarkable stories from the wild.